The hologram of history. If you were to close your eyes and conjure the image of a medieval knight, the picture is almost instantaneous and culturally universal. You likely see a figure encased in polished plate armor, gleaming under a benevolent sun, standing as a bulwark against chaos. He is stoic, devout, and riding a white charger that paws the ground with noble intent. He is Lancelot, the flawed but peerless lover. He is Galahad, the pure vessel. He is the hero who slays the dragon, rescues the damsel from the tower, and upholds the law with a sword that only strikes the wicked. This image has been fed to us through centuries of filtration, from the romantic verses of Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century to the Victorian revivals of Sir Walter Scott, and finally into the technicolor epics of Hollywood and the pixelated fantasies of modern role-playing games. In our collective imagination, the knight is the ultimate arbiter of justice, a warrior monk whose capacity for violence is strictly curbed by a rigid, internalized moral code. But if we scrub away the Hollywood gloss and step into the mud of the 14th century, a starkly different figure emerges. The reality of knighthood was less about rescuing princesses and more about enforcing feudal property rights, crushing peasant uprisings, and securing ransoms to pay for mounting debts. The knight was often a mercenary in all but name, a landowner with a license to kill, and a pivotal cog in a machine of oppression. This disconnect begs a fundamental historical question. Was the concept of chivalry a genuine moral compass that guided the actions of violent men, or was it the most successful public relations campaign in human history? The Knight's Code, the Pillars of Chivalry. To understand the myth, we must first understand the stated ideal. The Code of Chivalry was not a single written document like the Magna Carta or the U.S. Constitution, but rather a loose collection of ethos, social expectations, and religious vows that evolved organically from the 11th to the 15th centuries. At its height, it was a triad of values that theoretically balanced the warrior's soul. Prowess. This was the foundational requirement. A knight had to be good at violence. Without martial skill, the other virtues were meaningless. A knight who could not ride, lance, and kill was merely a landowner in a costume. This virtue celebrated physical strength, endurance, and the terrifying ability to inflict harm. Loyalty. A knight was a vassal. His sword belonged to his liege lord. Betrayal was the ultimate sin, famously reserved for the deepest circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, where Judas and Brutus are chewed eternally by Satan. Loyalty was the glue of the feudal system. Without it, the intricate web of land ownership and military service would collapse. Generosity and courtesy. Largesse was crucial because hoarding wealth was seen as bourgeois. A true noble gave freely to his followers. Courtoisie dictated behavior at court, particularly the complex, ritualized deference shown to noble women, which birthed the genre of courtly love. On paper, this code created a warrior caste that protected the weak, widows, orphans, and the church, and defended the faith. It suggested that a knight's power was justified because it was used in service of the greater good. The church added a layer of spiritual obligation, transforming the act of killing into a holy duty, provided it was directed at the right enemies, infidels, heretics, or enemies of the king. The historical irony is that chivalry was invented not because knights were naturally noble, but because they were terrifying. In the chaotic centuries following the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, Europe was teeming with mounted warriors who answered to no central authority. The breakdown of centralized government meant that local castellans, castle owners, became petty kings. These early knights were effectively local thugs in mail armor. They fought private wars over boundaries and inheritance, raided neighboring villages for supplies, and extorted the peasantry through violence. They were the protection racket of the Dark Ages. The Church, lacking an army of its own, faced a crisis. How do you stop armed sociopaths from burning down monasteries and slaughtering the flock? The solution was the peace of God, Pax Dei, and the truce of God, Truga Dei movements in the late 10th century. The clergy gathered knights in fields filled with holy relics and made them swear oaths to limit their violence. They essentially told the knights, "You are not thugs. You are the soldiers of Christ. Your violence is holy, but only if you follow these rules. You cannot kill on Sundays. You cannot kill clergy. You cannot steal from the poor." Chivalry, therefore, began as a containment strategy. It was a bridle placed on a wild horse. The elaborate rituals of knighting, the all-night vigils in chapels, the white bathrobes symbolizing purity, the blessing of the sword, were psychological tools designed to domesticate a warrior class that was tearing society apart. While the Church used chivalry to curb violence, the aristocracy eventually co-opted it to justify their existence. By the High Middle Ages, the feudal system was under strain. The rise of rich urban merchants, the increasing power of kings, and the development of professional infantry threatened the status of the minor nobility. In this context, chivalry became a potent brand identity. It was a way for the warrior class to say, "We are different, we are superior, we deserve our tax exemptions and our land, not just because we have swords, but because we possess a moral quality that the commoner lacks." It turned a class based on violence into a class based on virtue. The literature of the time, the Arthurian romances, the chansons de geste, songs of deeds, served as propaganda. These stories were recited in great halls to audiences of knights, reinforcing their self-image. They glossed over the messy reality of dysentery, siege warfare, and scorched earth tactics, replacing them with sterile duels of honor and mystical quests for the Holy Grail. It was a cultural feedback loop. Knights paid poets to write about how noble knights were, and then modeled their behavior, at least in public, on the poems. The tournament, originally a brutal mock battle, evolved into a spectator sport with rules and pageantry, allowing knights to act out the fantasy of chivalry in a controlled environment. When we look at the actual behavior of knights on the battlefield, the code often disintegrated upon contact with economic reality. Medieval warfare was incredibly expensive. A full harness of plate armor in the 15th century could cost the equivalent of a luxury car today. A trained warhorse, destrier, cost even more. To pay for this equipment and the retinue required to maintain it, war had to be profitable. The primary goal of a knight in battle was rarely to kill his opponent, but to capture him. A dead enemy was useless. A living noble could be ransomed for a fortune, sometimes enough to build a castle or pay off a lifetime of debts. This created a bizarre two-tiered system of war. When knights fought knights, it was often a sporting affair where death was accidental or regrettable. Chivalry applied to peers. Combatants would often yield rather than fight to the death, trusting their captors to treat them well, as they were valuable assets. However, when knights fought common archers or peasant levies, there was no mercy. The code did not apply to the 99% of the population who weren't noble. A peasant rebel was not a combatant to be respected. He was property that had malfunctioned. Perhaps the greatest indictment of the chivalric myth is the tactic known as the chevauchée. During the Hundred Years' War, English knights, supposed paragons of chivalry like the Black Prince, did not typically ride out to meet the French army in honorable single combat. Instead, they engaged in systematic raids through the French countryside. They burned villages, destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and murdered peasants. The strategic goal was to destroy the economic base of the enemy lord, proving he could not protect his people. It was terrorism and economic warfare, pure and simple. Yet these same men would return to court, dance the pavane, write poetry to their ladies, and be hailed as the flower of chivalry. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. A knight could be a refined gentleman in the hall and a butcher in the field without seeing any contradiction, because the victims in the field fell outside the circle of chivalric protection. So, was the ideal knight a lie? Not entirely. There were men who genuinely struggled to live up to the code. Figures like William Marshall, who rose from a landless son to the regent of England through skill and loyalty, or Godfrey of Bouillon, the Crusader king, attempted to balance the brutal necessities of their profession with the spiritual and social demands of their station. For them, chivalry was a heavy burden, a genuine moral compass in a violent world that offered few others. However, for the institution as a whole, the ideal knight was largely a construct. It was a beautiful tapestry hung over a crumbling, blood-stained wall. It allowed a violent cast of warriors to sleep at night, convinced they were the heroes of the story, rather than the oppressors. It provided a framework for civilization to function amidst chaos, but it was a framework built on exclusion. The myth of the knight persists today not because it was historically accurate, but because we want it to be true. We have a deep psychological need to believe that power can be married to virtue, that violence can be tamed by a code of honor, and that there are guardians who protect the innocent simply because it is right. The reality was messier, bloodier, and far more human, but the mask they forged remains one of the most enduring symbols in human history, casting a long shadow over our modern concepts of heroism and duty. Let's delve into the containment efforts towards the early knights. The first and most aggressive attempt to tame the knight came from the Catholic Church. By the turn of the millennium, the clergy faced an existential threat. The fragmentation of political power meant there was no king strong enough to protect the church's vast lands. Monasteries and cathedrals, often wealthy, stockpiled with gold and undefended, became prime targets for raiding knights looking for easy plunder. The church realized that if it could not physically defeat these warriors, it had to mentally and spiritually reprogram them. The peace and truce of God. Lacking a standing army to enforce order, the church innovated a form of mass psychological warfare. The movement began in earnest in 989 AD at the Council of Charroux with the Peace of God, Pax Dei. Bishops and abbots gathered thousands of knights in open fields, surrounded by the trembling relics of saints, bones, scraps of cloth, and splinters of the cross, and vast crowds of the faithful. Amidst chanting, incense, and the ringing of bells, they extracted terrified oaths from the warriors. The knights were forced to swear on their salvation that they would not attack unarmed clergy, peasants, merchants, or farm animals.
The threat was not prison, which the church could not impose, but excommunication. To the medieval mind, this was a spiritual death sentence that cut a man off from the sacraments and condemned him to eternal hellfire. This was followed by the Truce of God, Trega Dei, in the 11th century, which attempted to regulate when violence could occur. It strictly forbade fighting on holy days, eventually expanding to ban warfare from Thursday evening, in memory of the Last Supper, until Monday morning. While these measures had limited success, violent men often found loopholes or simply paid penance after the fact. They established a revolutionary concept. Violence was not an arbitrary right of the strong, but a force that could be regulated by a moral code. It planted the seed that a warrior had a duty to something higher than his own greed. The true transformation, however, occurred in 1095 with Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade. The Church realized it could not stop the knights from killing. Agra was their profession and their identity. So instead of suppressing it, they redirected it. The Crusade offered a new spiritual paradigm, the Miles Christi, soldier of Christ. Suddenly, the act of killing, which had previously required penance and endangered the soul, became a path to salvation, provided the violence was directed toward infidels and enemies of the faith. Theologians like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux articulated a new doctrine where killing an evildoer was not homicide but malicide, the killing of evil itself. This fusion of piety and prowess gave birth to the military orders, such as the Templars and Hospitallers. These men lived as monks, but fought as soldiers, taking vows of poverty and chastity while wielding heavy cavalry lances. They became the archetypes of the chaste, devout warrior monk. The knighting ceremony itself was liturgized. The sword was placed on the altar, blessed with holy water, and the knight was dubbed in the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George. The Church had successfully co-opted the thug, turning him into a consecrated guardian of the faith.
Crusades fundamentally reconciled the necessity of the sword with the gospel of peace. They did not merely utilize the knight, they reinvented him. They took the existing rough-hewn codes of feudal loyalty, based on land and lineage, and fused them with the white-hot intensity of religious fanaticism. This era witnessed the transformation of the knight's code from a local set of professional rules for landholders into a transcendent spiritual vocation. It was the crucible that burned away the image of the feudal thug and forged the ideal of the paladin, the holy warrior whose sword was not just a weapon of war, but the very instrument of God's will on earth. The Crusades offered a solution to the warrior's existential crisis. He no longer had to abandon his sword to serve God. He simply had to point it in the right direction. In November 1095, Pope Urban II called for an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem, promising something that no king, emperor, or lord could offer: the remission of sins. This promise fundamentally altered the DNA of the Knight's Code in two critical ways. War as penance. Previously, a knight went to confession after a battle to atone for the killing. Now, the battle was the confession. The act of marching, starving, and skewering an infidel became a liturgical act, as cleansing as prayer or fasting. Violence was transmuted into piety. A knight could now save his soul not by laying down his sword, but by swinging it harder in the name of the Church. This was a theological earthquake. It turned the heavy cavalry charge into an act of charity toward God. The new vow.
The feudal oath of loyalty to a liege lord, the bedrock of medieval society, was superseded by a direct vow to God. When a knight took the cross, crucis signatus, he placed himself under the direct jurisdiction of the church. This added a layer of independence and spiritual superiority to the knightly class. He was no longer just a vassal fighting for a plot of land. He was a soldier of heaven fighting for the center of the world. This elevation gave the code a moral weight it had never possessed before. It democratized salvation for the warrior class. They no longer needed to retire to monasteries to die in grace.
If the First Crusade introduced the idea of the holy warrior, the military orders institutionalized it. In the early 12th century, a new and radical concept emerged that baffled contemporary observers: the fighting monk. The Knights Templar, founded circa 1119, and the Knights Hospitaller became the gold standard of the Crusader Code. The Cistercian theologian Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote a revolutionary treatise for the Templars titled In Praise of the New Knighthood. In it, he codified the ethos of this new breed, providing the intellectual justification for holy violence. He argued that when a secular knight killed, it was homicide and a sin. But when a Templar killed an evildoer, it was malicide, the killing of evil itself. He famously wrote, "The Knight of Christ may strike with confidence and die yet more confidently, for he serves Christ when he strikes and saves himself when he falls." The military orders introduced a rigid, almost robotic discipline to the Knights Code. Secular knights were often rowdy, individualistic, and prone to breaking ranks to seek personal glory. The Templars, by contrast, were forbidden to hunt, hawk, gamble, or laugh loudly. They fought in silence, never broke formation, and were the last to retreat. This professionalism bled into the wider chivalric culture, raising the standard for what it meant to be a disciplined warrior. The primitive rule of the Templars dictated everything from how they ate in silence to how they slept with a light burning, creating a total institution of war. The orders stripped away the vanity of knighthood. They cut their hair short, refused to bathe often, and wore simple wool. They taught that a true knight should value the strength of his arm and the purity of his soul over the gold on his scabbard or the embroidery on his cloak. This introduced a strain of stoicism to the code that persisted for centuries, separating the true knight from the mere fop. The Crusades were not a monologue of European aggression. They were a dialogue of violence spanning 2 centuries. The European knights found themselves locked in a multi-generational war with Islamic civilizations that possessed their own sophisticated martial codes, known as Furusiya. This code emphasized horsemanship, poetry, bravery, and generosity, values that eerily mirrored the emerging European chivalry. Contrary to the propaganda of mindless savages, often preached in Europe, the Crusaders often found themselves respecting their enemies more than their own allies. The memoirs of Arab nobleman Usama ibn Munqidh reveal complex friendships between Frankish knights and Muslim warriors during times of truce. The figure of Saladin, Salah ad-Din, became a legend in Europe, often cited as a paragon of chivalry, despite being a pagan in their eyes. Dante even placed Saladin in limbo, alongside the virtuous Greeks and Romans, a testament to the respect he commanded. Respect for the noble enemy. The Crusades taught knights that honor was not exclusive to Christendom. Stories of Saladin sending fresh horses to Richard the Lionheart when his steed was killed, or sending sherbet and ice when Richard was sick with fever, shamed many Christian knights into behaving better. The code expanded to include a grudging, professional respect for a worthy adversary. It established the precedent that a knight treats his equal with dignity, regardless of faith. Refining the art of war.
Exposure to Eastern tactics, light cavalry, and advanced fortifications forced the Frankish knights to adapt. The code of prowess evolved from a reliance on brute force, the thunderous charge, to a more tactical, intellectual approach to warfare. They learned that courage without wisdom was merely suicide. They adopted the surcoat to deflect the sun, improved their castle designs, like Crac the Chevalier, and learned the value of logistics, enriching the knight's skill set beyond mere bludgeoning.
When the knights returned to Europe, or when their stories did, carried by troubadours and chroniclers, they brought back more than just spices, silk, and sugar. They brought a transformed ideology that permanently altered the European social landscape. Before the Crusades, knights were often indistinguishable in their mail armor. In the chaotic multinational armies of the Holy Land, identification became a matter of life and death. A commander needed to know who was holding the left flank through the dust of Syria. Knights began painting distinct geometric symbols and colors on their shields to be recognized. This necessity birthed the complex science of heraldry. When these knights returned home, these symbols ceased to be mere tactical markers and became symbols of immense pride, proof that I was there. The coat of arms became the visual language of the knight's code, representing a lineage of bravery that had been tested in the fires of the East. It turned the knight's shield into a resume of his family's honor, creating a visual caste system that dominated European society for centuries. The Crusades embedded the idea of the great undertaking into the chivalric DNA. It was no longer enough for a knight to simply hold land, collect taxes, and bully neighbors. A true knight needed a quest. He needed to travel to distant, exotic lands, endure hardship, and fight for a cause greater than himself. This influenced the Arthurian romances written in the 12th and 13th centuries. The literary quest for the Holy Grail is a direct allegorical reflection of the crusading impulse, a search for the divine through martial struggle in a foreign land. The Grail Knight, like Galahad, was the perfected image of the crusader, chaste, zealous, and unstoppable. Finally, the Crusades raised the barrier to entry for knighthood. Crusading was ruinously expensive. A knight had to fund his own journey, equipment, and retinue for years. Many families went bankrupt or mortgaged their estates to the church to afford the trip. This economic pressure widened the gap between the wealthy milites, knights, and the common pedites, foot soldiers. The code became more elitist, reinforcing the idea that nobility was a matter of blood and spiritual destiny, justified by the immense financial and physical sacrifices made in the Holy Land. It solidified knighthood as a closed aristocracy rather than an open profession of arms.
The Crusades were, by modern standards, a catastrophe of human suffering, marked by massacres, intolerance, and ultimate military failure. Yet, they were the forge that hammered the knight's code into its most enduring form. They took the rough feudal vassal and gave him a cosmic cause. They took the thug and gave him a rosary. They introduced the radical concept that a warrior could be a holy figure, that violence could be an act of love for God, and that a man's honor was measured not just by his strength, but by the distance he was willing to travel to fight for his beliefs. The legacy of the Crusades is that it gave the West the archetype of the paladin, the flawed, dangerous, but undeniably compelling figure who believes that with enough faith and enough steel, he can conquer the world for the heavens. While the Church worked to save the knight's soul through crusades, the secular courts of Europe worked to refine his manners. As the feudal system stabilized in the 12th century, the nobility found themselves with more leisure time and disposable income. The rough, mud-stained warrior who smelled of the stables and knew only the language of command was no longer a suitable companion for the sophisticated atmosphere of the high court. The epicenter of this cultural shift was Aquitaine in southern France, under the patronage of powerful, educated noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter, Marie de Champagne. They patronized troubadours, poets, and musicians who sang of fin amour, refined love. This literature introduced a radical, subversive idea to a patriarchal society, that a knight's worth was measured not just by how many heads he could split, but by his capacity for emotion, love, and suffering. In popular romances, like those of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde, the knight became a vassal to his lady. He served her with the same absolute obedience he owed his liege lord, often addressing her as domina, mistress, or lord. He was expected to be courtly, to speak eloquently, to appreciate music, to dress well, to play chess, and to control his temper. This courtly love was deeply paradoxical, and often a game played by the elite. It frequently celebrated adulterous love, since noble marriages were political business arrangements, not romantic ones, yet it demanded chastity and restraint. The knight was meant to pine for his lady from afar, performing great deeds in her name without expectation of physical reward. This created a sophisticated tension between the church's demand for sexual purity and the court's demand for romantic devotion. It enriched the concept of chivalry with layers of complexity. The brute was taught to be a gentleman, and the killer was taught to be a poet. It civilized the warrior class by making social grace a prerequisite for status.
Underneath the incense of the cathedral and the perfume of the court lay the mud and blood of the battlefield. Ultimately, the knight's code was shaped by the cold, hard necessities of medieval warfare. The rules of honor were not just abstract ideals, they were a survival manual for a specific class of people who operated high-value military assets. Feudal society was a pyramid built on promises. There were no complex written contracts, no digitized records, and no central police forces to enforce the law. The entire political and military system rested on the fidelitas, faithfulness, of a vassal to his lord. When a knight did homage, placing his hands between the hands of his lord, he was literally handing over his life and liberty in exchange for land and protection. If a knight broke his oath, the system collapsed. A lord could not go to war if he could not trust his captains to show up. Therefore, honor and truthfulness were not mere virtues, they were the hard currency of the realm. A knight, known as an oath-breaker, became a pariah, unemployable and unprotected by the law. Loyalty was a survival strategy. To be false was to be ejected from society, effectively ending one's life as a noble. The chivalric ideals of mercy and fair play were also rooted in economic self-interest. By the high Middle Ages, a knight was a walking tank. A full harness of plate armor, a trained war horse, destrier, squires, and weaponry represented a massive capital investment, equivalent to the cost of a modern jet fighter or luxury vehicle. To kill a fellow noble on the battlefield was to burn money.
The culture of ransom dictated that a defeated knight should be captured,
treated well, and returned to his family in exchange for a large sum of gold. This created a brotherhood of arms that transcended national borders. French and English knights might kill each other's archers without a second thought, but they treated each other with a bizarre professional courtesy. They belonged to the same exclusive club. A knight would spare a fallen opponent, not out of the goodness of his heart, but because he hoped for the same treatment when his own horse stumbled. Crucially, this code was strictly class-specific. The mercy shown to a fellow knight was rarely extended to the peasant archer or the rebellious foot soldier. The archer was not a terrifying peer to be respected, nor a walking bag of gold to be ransomed. He was a nuisance to be exterminated. Thus, the pragmatism of the battlefield reinforced the elitist nature of the code. Honor was a luxury reserved for the rich, acting as a mutual insurance policy among the aristocracy.
Let's dive into the instances Knight Code upheld or not. When the stakes for personal honor or social standing, knights often performed the code to perfection. These moments were not just about kindness, they were about proving one's membership in an elite international club. The dinner at Poitiers, 1356. After the English decimated the French army at the Battle of Poitiers, the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, found himself in possession of the ultimate prize, King John II of France. According to the chronicler Froissart, the prince did not chain the king or throw him in a dungeon. Instead, he threw a lavish supper in his own red silk tent. The Black Prince refused to sit at the table with the king. Instead, he stood and served the king his food, pouring his wine and declaring that he was not worthy to sit by the side of so great a monarch and so valiant a man. This was performative humility. By elevating his prisoner, the Black Prince was elevating the value of his victory. A king treated like a king is worth a king's ransom, eventually set at 3 million gold crowns, an amount so high it destabilized the French currency for decades. The Pas d'Armes of the Golden Tree, 1468. To celebrate the marriage of Charles the Bold in Bruges, the court staged the Pas d'Armes del Arbre d'Or, Passage of Arms of the Golden Tree. This was not a brawl, it was a living novel. A giant, a courtier in costume, led a dwarf and a damsel in distress into the arena, chaining a golden pine tree to the ground. Knights spent days jousting, not to kill, but to break lances in the most stylish way possible. It was a display of largesse and courtoisie, proving that violence could be beautiful if wrapped in enough silk and gold. It was war sublimated into art. The Battle of Bremule, 1119. A clash between Henry I of England and Louis VI of France. Out of 900 knights who fought in this open field battle, only 3 were killed. This wasn't an accident. Knights aimed to capture, not kill. Killing a brother knight was literally destroying money, the ransom, and sinning against the ethos of the brotherhood. They wore heavy mail that made them nearly invincible to swords, and they agreed, unspokenly, to treat the battlefield like a rough sporting match.
When the enemy was not a brother knight, that is, a peasant, a pagan, or a rebel, or when money was off the table, the code evaporated instantly. The massacre at Limoges, 1370. The Bishop of Limoges, a close friend of the Black Prince and godfather to his son, surrendered the city to the French. The prince, sick with dysentery and carried on a litter, was consumed by a fury that overrode all chivalry. Upon retaking the city, the prince ignored the code of mercy. Froissart describes a scene where 3,000 men, women, and children threw themselves on their knees before the prince, crying, "Mercy, gentle sir." The prince was unmoved. His knights, usually so concerned with honor, proceeded to massacre the population. The flower of chivalry watched from his litter as his men hacked down civilians. The code did not protect traders or commoners. The Agincourt Exception, 1415. Toward the end of the Battle of Agincourt, King Henry V feared the French prisoners, who outnumbered his weary troops, might pick up weapons and attack from the rear. Henry ordered the immediate execution of hundreds of captured French knights. The English knights refused to obey the order. They refused not because it was immoral to kill defenseless men, but because they were being asked to slit the throats of their winning lottery tickets. They were thinking of the lost ransom money. Henry had to commission a squad of 200 archers, commoners who didn't care about knightly codes or ransoms, to go through the lines, stabbing the bound French nobility in the face and neck.
The Free Company of Sir John Hawkwood. The figure. Sir John Hawkwood was an English knight who, during peace times, turned his unit into a free company, essentially a private mafia army. They roamed Italy, threatening to burn cities unless they were paid patè, protection money. In 1377, at the massacre of Cesena, Hawkwood's men, serving the papacy, were ordered to punish a rebellious town. Chivalry dictated protecting the weak. Instead, Hawkwood's knights locked the city gates and slaughtered between 2,500 and 5,000 civilians, famously shouting, "Blood! Blood!" as they worked. This was the knight as a contract killer. The Teutonic Knights and Pippin of Pomerania. The Teutonic Knights operated in the Baltic against pagans, which conveniently removed the theological requirement for mercy. When they captured a local leader named Pippin of Pomerania, who had resisted them, they did not treat him as a noble prisoner. They slit his belly open, nailed his navel to a tree, and forced him to walk around it until he was disemboweled. This was justified as doing God's work against non-Christians, proving that the code often stopped at the border of Christendom.
Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, Third Crusade, 1191 to 1192. This is the high watermark of chivalric myth, notable because it crossed religious lines. To the Crusaders, Muslims were infidels, yet Saladin was held in higher esteem than many Christian kings. At the Battle of Jaffa, King Richard I of England, the Lionheart, was fighting on foot after his horse was killed. Saladin, watching from a nearby hill, was reportedly appalled that a king should fight in the dust like a common infantryman. He sent 2 fresh Arabian horses down to Richard in the middle of the battle, accompanied by a groom. When Richard fell ill with a severe fever, likely scurvy or malaria, Saladin did not attack the weakened camp. Instead, he sent his own physicians and gifts of snow and fresh fruit, peaches and pears from Damascus, to cool the fever. This wasn't peace. They still wanted to kill each other, but they insisted on killing each other properly, maintaining the dignity of their rank above the brutality of the conflict. The Chevalier de Bayard at Brescia, 1512. Pierre Terray, Seigneur de Bayard, was known as the knight without fear and without reproach. His conduct at the siege of Brescia perfectly illustrates the code of protection of the weak. After the French stormed the Italian city of Brescia, a chaotic sack ensued. Soldiers were looting homes and assaulting civilians. Bayard was wounded and taken into the home of a noblewoman and her 2 daughters. Instead of treating them as spoils of war, the norm, he posted his own guards at the door to prevent other soldiers from entering. He recuperated there for weeks. Upon leaving, the noblewoman offered him a heavy casket of 2,500 ducats, a fortune, to thank him for saving their honor. Bayard refused the money for himself. He accepted it only to immediately give it to the 2 daughters for their marriage dowries. Bayard represents the true believer. For him, the knighthood was a sacred vocation, not a license to steal.
These are the instances where the mask drops completely. show how knights behaved when they felt the rules no longer applied, usually against heretics, rebels, or fellow Christians who had something they wanted. The Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, 1204. The knights of the Fourth Crusade swore oaths on the cross to liberate Jerusalem. Instead, they got distracted by Venetian debt and politics, turning their weapons on Constantinople, the capital of the Christian Byzantine Empire. After entering the city as allies/mercenaries, the Crusaders turned on the inhabitants. The soldiers of Christ stripped the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, of its silver and gold. They smashed the altar and seated a prostitute on the patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs. They burned the library and raped nuns in the convents. They justified it by labeling the Orthodox Greeks as schismatics or heretics, proving that theological technicalities were often used to loophole the code's requirements for mercy. The suppression of the Jacquerie, 1358. The Jacquerie was a massive peasant revolt in France. The code dictated that a knight must protect the weak. Instead, the knights viewed the peasants as rabid dogs. The leader of the peasants, Guillaume Cail, was invited by Charles the Bad, King of Navarre, for parley, peace talks. Cail accepted, believing that a king would honor the code of truce. Charles the Bad seized Cail immediately. He reasoned that since Cail was of common blood, no oath made to him was binding. The knights mocked Cail's ambition to be a ruler. They crowned him with a red-hot iron tripod, a mockery of a crown, before beheading him. This incident proved that chivalry was a class-exclusive contract.
The Banquet of Blood, Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights operated in the Baltic, fighting the Northern Crusades against pagan Lithuanians. During a period of truce, the Teutonic Knights invited the local Lithuanian nobility to a feast to discuss peace terms. Once the doors were locked and the guests were seated, the knights signaled their soldiers to enter and slaughter the unarmed guests. Because the guests were pagans, the knights argued they had no souls and no rights. The code of chivalry was weaponized as a trap.
The Blind King of Bohemia, Battle of Crusades, 1346. This is often cited as bravery, but it reveals the suicidal impracticality of the code. King John of Bohemia was blind, yet as a knight he felt the crushing social pressure not to miss the battle. He ordered his knights to tie their horses' bridles to his own, so that he could not be separated from them, and they rode into the English lines together to strike a blow. It was a slaughter. The English archers cut them down. After the battle, the bodies were found still tied together. This was the dark side of honor. The fear of looking cowardly, shame culture, drove men to effectively commit suicide rather than act pragmatically. These instances show that the Knight Code was not a binary switch, on-off, but a sliding scale dependent on identity and economics. Noble plus rich plus Christian. The code applies fully. Richard and Saladin, Bayard. Noble plus poor. The code applies partially, but you are expendable. Nicopolis. Commoner or rebel. The code does not apply. You are livestock. The Jacquerie. Heretic or pagan. The code is inverted. Cruelty is a virtue. Teutonic Knights.
The Knight Code as a tool of social control. When we study history, we often look at the what, battles, dates, kings, and neglect the why. Why did a warrior caste, whose primary job was inflicting death, invent a code based on mercy, piety, and art?
The answer lies not in romance, but in sociology. The Code of Chivalry was not merely a list of rules for good behavior, it was a sophisticated piece of social technology. It was designed to solve the biggest problem of the Middle Ages. How do you control a class of violent men who own all the weapons? The code served two vital functions. It provided a moral license for the aristocracy to rule, legitimacy, and it created an exclusive club that kept the wrong kind of violence out, differentiation. The sanctification of the sword, legitimizing power. In the early Middle Ages, post-Rome, pre-chivalry, a knight was simply a man with a horse and a spear. He was often little more than a glorified thug who extorted local peasants. This created a volatile society where the strong preyed on the weak without restriction. The church and the high nobility realized this was unsustainable. To maintain social order, they had to transform the thug into the guardian. The Three Estates propaganda. The Code of Chivalry anchored the feudal structure known as the Three Estates, or Three Orders. Oratores, those who pray, the clergy. Bellatores, those who fight, the knights or nobility. Laboratores, those who work, the peasantry. By wrapping knighthood in religious rituals, vigils, fasting, and blessing of swords, the code elevated the knight above the common mercenary. It argued that the knight's violence was not a sin, but a divine duty. The social contract, the code told the peasant, "You must work to feed me, because I am the only thing standing between you and the wolves." The reality, often the knights were the wolves. However, the code provided a narrative that justified the crushing tax burdens and lack of freedom for the 95% of the population. It legitimized the aristocracy's monopoly on violence.
Differentiating knight from brigand. As the Middle Ages progressed, the line between a knight and a mercenary blurred. Both had horses, both had armor, both killed for a living. The code became a branding tool. It was the velvet rope that separated the elite aristocracy from the common routiers, mercenaries, and brigands. The performance of courtoisie. Violence was cheap. Manners were expensive. To distinguish themselves from common killers, knights adopted courtoisie, courtly love and manners. The barrier to entry. Learning to dance, write poetry, speak refined French, and understand the subtle rules of heraldry required time and education. A common mercenary could learn to swing a sword, but he couldn't afford to learn the lute. The function. This cultural barrier ensured that social mobility remained low. If you couldn't perform the theater of chivalry, you weren't a knight, no matter how well you fought. Restrained violence versus total war. The code distinguished the knight by how he killed. The brigand kills for efficiency, uses ambushes, poisons, or attacks from behind. The knight kills with process. He issues challenges. He respects flags of truce. He fights face to face. This distinction was crucial for the knight's self-image. By adhering to arbitrary rules, example, don't attack an unarmed man, the knight could convince himself he was a civilized warrior, not a murderer. It sterilized the horror of their profession. The shame culture. The most powerful enforcement mechanism of the code was not guilt, internal, but shame, external. The threat. To be unchivalrous was to be socially ostracized. A knight who broke his word or acted with cowardice would be shunned by the brotherhood. The effect. This peer pressure forced knights to conform to the social order. It made them predictable. A king knew his knights would likely follow orders, even suicidal ones, rather than face the social death of dishonor.
Critics often point out that knights constantly broke their vows. They argue this proves the code was a sham. This misses the point.
A moral code does not need to be perfectly followed to be effective. The aspiration is the point. The code was aspirational. It set a standard so high, the Galahad ideal, perfectly chaste, perfectly humble, perfectly deadly, that no human could actually meet it. The psychology of striving. The gap between the real, bloody battles, dysentery, greed, and the ideal, Arthurian legend, gave knights a goal. It gave their lives meaning beyond mere survival. The civilizing effect. Even if a knight only followed the code 50% of the time, that was 50% less rape, pillage, and murder than would have occurred without the code. It acted as a governor engine on a machine of war, slowing down the cruelty just enough to allow civilization to function. Literature as training manuals. The romances, stories of King Arthur, Lancelot, and Roland, were not just entertainment, they were instructional propaganda. They taught young men how to feel. They taught that a true man weeps when his friend dies, protects women, and serves his lord. By consuming these stories, young aristocrats internalized the values of the ruling class before they ever picked up a lance. It was a form of indoctrination that turned raw aggression into loyal service.
The Knight Code was effective because it wasn't learned. It was programmed into the aristocracy from childhood. The education of a knight was a 14-year apprenticeship in submission and social signaling. The page, age 7 to 14, submission and service. At age 7, a noble son was sent away from his family to live in the castle of a liege lord. This was the first step of social control, breaking the bond with the nuclear family and replacing it with loyalty to the hierarchy. The role. The boy became a page. He did not learn to fight yet. He learned to serve. He waited on tables, cleaned clothes, and ran messages. The lesson. Before you can command, you must learn to obey. This instilled the idea that service is not degrading, it is the price of nobility. It separated the noble servant from the common servant. The squire, age 14 to 21, the shadow of the knight. At puberty, the boy became a squire. He was assigned to a specific knight, becoming his shadow. The indoctrination. The squire polished the armor, learning its value, cared for the horses, learning logistics, and stood behind his master at tournaments. He absorbed the code by osmosis. He watched how his master spoke to ladies, how he treated prisoners, and how he prayed. The gatekeeping. Not every squire became a knight. If a squire showed cowardice or a lack of courtesy, he could be denied the accolade. This probationary period ensured that only those who fully adopted the software of the code were given the hardware, the rank of knight.
One of the most brilliant, yet bizarre aspects of the code was the invention of courtly love, fenimore. Castles were filled with young, unmarried, aggressive men, bachelors, squires, and very few noble women, often the wives of the lords. This was a recipe for social disaster. The code solved this by gamifying desire. Knights were encouraged to pledge their love to a lady who was typically married to their superior, socially out of their league, and completely unattainable. The mechanism of control. The ideal. The knight was expected to perform feats of bravery in the name of this lady. He would wear her token, a sleeve or handkerchief, in a tournament. The benefit? This sublimated sexual frustration into martial service. Instead of trying to seduce the lord's wife, which would cause a civil war, the knight tried to impress her by serving the lord better. Civilizing force. To please the lady, the knight had to write poetry, play music, and wash. This softened the rough edges of the warrior class, making them tolerable to live with indoors during peacetime.
The knight code as a social tool eventually failed. It didn't fail because men stopped believing in it. It failed because it became economically obsolete. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the state began to form. Kings realized that a professional standing army of commoners, paid in cash, not land, was more reliable than a group of prima donna knights obsessed with their own honor. A peasant with a long bow or an arquebus could kill a knight who had trained for 20 years. The battlefield became democratized by death. The knight was replaced by the officer. The officer's code was discipline, not chivalry. Chivalry says, charge the enemy to show your bravery. Discipline says, hold the line and fire on my command.
The knight is dead. The heavy cavalry charge, the castle siege, and the feudal levy were rendered obsolete by gunpowder and the printing press over 500 years ago. Yet the software of the knight, the code of chivalry, refuses to be uninstalled. It haunts our language, our military laws, our romantic expectations, and our blockbuster movies. How did a code designed for axe-wielding killers evolve into a code for wearing a suit and tie? The transition happened in phases, stripping the violence away while keeping the social hierarchy. As the Middle Ages ended, the knight became the courtier. The definitive text of this era was Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, 1528. Martial skill was still admired, but it was no longer enough. The ideal man had to be educated, witty, and artistic. The rough man of war was polished into the man of state. Sprezzatura. Castiglione introduced the concept of sprezzatura, the art of making difficult tasks, writing, fencing, writing poetry, look effortless. This is the ancestor of the modern cool. The version of chivalry most of us know today isn't medieval, it's Victorian. In the 19th century, the British Empire needed a way to instill discipline in the young men who would run its colonies. They looked back to the Middle Ages, specifically a sanitized, romanticized version of it. Authors like Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, and Alfred Lord Tennyson, idols of the king, scrubbed the history books clean. They ignored the slaughter of peasants and the greed of ransoms. They presented King Arthur and Galahad as sexually pure, morally perfect icons. Elite British schools used this neo-chivalry to create the concept of the gentleman. The gentleman was stoic, fair-minded, and protective of the weak. Sports like rugby and cricket became the new tournaments, venues to practice fair play, a direct descendant of chivalric prowess. By the 20th century, the sword was gone entirely, but the manners remained. Ladies first, standing when someone enters a room, and the handshake, originally a gesture to show you weren't holding a weapon, are fossilized remnants of the code. Just as the medieval knight used the code to distinguish himself from the peasant, the modern gentleman uses manners to distinguish himself from the rude or uncivilized. It remains a tool of class distinction.
If you scratch the surface of almost any modern action hero, you will find a medieval knight staring back. We have simply swapped the horses for spaceships or muscle cars. George Lucas didn't hide his influences. The Jedi are Templar knights in space. The lightsaber is Excalibur, a weapon of a more civilized age that requires immense skill, unlike the clumsy blaster, crossbow, or gun. Jedi are forbidden from attachment, chastity, or purity, serve a higher power, the Force or God, and act as peacekeepers. When Luke Skywalker throws away his weapon rather than kill his father, he is performing the ultimate act of chivalric mercy. Batman is the ultimate modern knight. He is a landed aristocrat,
Bruce Wayne, who uses his wealth to buy armor and weapons to protect the peasantry, Gotham citizens, from bandits. His no-kill rule is a rigid adherence to a personal chivalric code. Captain America represents the perfect knight, unwaveringly moral, shielding the weak with a literal shield. In Avengers: Age of Ultron, the fact that only he and Vision can lift Thor's hammer is a direct retelling of the sword in the stone myth. Only the pure of heart can wield the weapon of power. The American Western is the chivalric romance transported to the frontier. The gunfighter in movies like Shane or The Magnificent Seven is a knight-errant, a wandering warrior with a personal code operating in a land with no law. He rides into town, defeats the dragon, the robber baron or gang, saves the town, but cannot settle down because his violence separates him from civilization.
The most serious legacy of chivalry is found in international law. The medieval concept that war should have rules, that it is not a total free-for-all, is the foundation of the Geneva Conventions. The medieval practice of ransoming knights, rather than killing them, evolved into the legal requirement to treat prisoners of war, POWs, humanely. The peace of God, which forbade attacking clergy and farmers, is the ancestor of laws protecting civilians and medics. We still struggle with the same contradiction the knights did. How do you apply moral rules to the immoral act of killing? Modern soldiers, like medieval knights, are often caught between the code, rules of engagement, and the brutal reality of survival. We cannot discuss the legacy of chivalry without addressing its gender dynamics. In the 21st century, the knight in shining armor trope is viewed with increasing skepticism. Chivalry placed noble women on a pedestal. While this looked like worship, it was often a form of control. A woman on a pedestal cannot move. She is an object to be won or protected, not an agent of her own destiny. Modern critics argue that performative chivalry, opening doors, paying for dinner, can be a form of benevolent sexism, implying that women are less capable or in need of male provision. Modern storytelling has begun to deconstruct this. In Game of Thrones, Brienne of Tarth represents the true knight, loyal, brave, celibate, while the actual male knights are monsters. This highlights that honor is a behavior, not a gender or a title.
Why does the Knight's Code endure? Why, 500 years after the last armored charge, do we still tell our children to play fair? Because the reality of human violence is terrifying. The historical knight was often a mercenary thug. The chivalric code was frequently a hypocritical mask. But the mask matters. The code of chivalry was humanity's first major attempt to say, because I have the power to kill you, I have the duty to protect you. It is an impossible ideal. We failed it in 1300, we failed it in 1914, and we fail it today. But the attempt to impose honor on chaos is what separates a society from a mob. The Knight's Code remains a complex blend of aspirational ideals and messy history, but it offers a timeless lesson. Power without a code is merely tyranny. This is the ending of this video. Thank you for watching.